Well, okay, it is freezing.
Whoa.
But we were away this week. We were in the mountains, Drakensberg Mountains, and specifically Golden Gate in Clarence, and it was
Yeah.
more than
So
freezing.
this is cold, but we have realized that cold is very relative.
Yes.
This is
Not so bad.
cold.
Not
This
so
is
bad.
Durban cold.
But we had a good week. We had a little bit of a family getaway into the mountains, and we missed the snow by probably a day or two. They put predicting snow for today or tomorrow in Clarence where we were. So kids are very disappointed. And also we were semi-sick the whole time, so we weren't really able to do all the things we wanted to do.
Even saw a doctor in Clarence. Doctor.
Yeah, I had to go see a doctor there, but now doing a little bit better. Antibiotics always work, so that's great.
Oh,
Great. So this morning we are, Tori, I am excited about Thessalonians.
France.
First time in my entire life. Do you know the book of Thessalonians, specifically this first chapter, has normally been used by the Pentecostal, charismatic, Protestant movement to kind of motivate for a type of a rapture. And these are things that I grew up believing up until I was about 10 years old, and my dad started saying, no, I don't think so. And it's always been a tough area for me to work through, because some of it surely does sound like what people are talking about when they talk about a rapture. But I think us using this method of considering Paul's context and his theological context it helps us to understand that it's not really about a rapture at all. But something rather different. So that's one of the things we're going to be touching on as we move through the book of Thessalonians. And so last week we did our first session on the book of Thessalonians, and it was most predominantly from chapter 1. Tori wasn't here. Tori was sick. My word.
We are quite a pair.
Yeah, we've been making turns with the kids for the last 4 weeks. But anyway, okay, so what did we do last week? Well, last week we spent a bit of time in the book of Thessalonians. Thessalonians is, together with Galatians, probably the earliest writing of Paul. That's why we call it early Paul, but also probably the earliest writing of the New Testament, which is highly significant, written before all the Gospels. So it's really our first Christian theology that we have in history. First hand account, because we believe at least the books we're dealing with are books that are authentically written by Paul, and that's pretty important. So what does the first chapter of Thessalonians do? And as we go through Thessalonians, we're going to kind of compare it with what we saw in Galatians, see if it matches up. Excuse me. So what we found in the first book of Galatians is Paul, it seems to be Thessalonians is what seems to be a trademark of Paul: faith, love, and hope. We find later on in 1 Corinthians. It's a book we'll deal with soon. But beautifully put here in 1 Thessalonians, there's like an adjective or an idea connected to each one of these virtues. And we find that in the third verse of chapter 1, where he says, the work of faith, the labor of love, and the patience of hope of Jesus Christ. Okay, so the work of faith, literally toil, means the work, the things you do. But the labor of love here is the word to cut. So it's a beautiful way to put across the idea of what love is. Love means to be cut. The higher the love, the higher the risk, like we all know from relationships. And then there's this hope. It's a patient hope, but it's not just a hope in something frivolous. For Paul, this hope is actually the hope in Jesus. And all of these things, faith, hope, and love, are all connected to the life of Jesus, the faithfulness of Jesus, the work he actually comes and does. Then the love of Jesus, which is something explained or demonstrated for us on the cross. And then lastly, there's this hope in Jesus, not only for what has happened, and this is an important part of what Paul sees. It's not only for what has happened, but it's also for what Jesus will do shortly. And this ties into Paul's expectation of this grand ending of all evil and evil principalities, and the coming of the kingdom of God on the earth, which is connected to the resurrection in that sense. So we find these three things there. I just want to see one or two. Oh, yeah. So the end of this chapter ends off like this. And he says, we wait, in verse 10, we wait for the Son from heaven. So in the apocalyptic Jewish literature, which we find in the book of Enoch, and we first Enoch, and also into the book of Jubilees, and then our Daniel, which is part of our Hebrew canon, there is the idea of the Son of Man that comes and is like the executor of this final battle, right? And so I think that it is pretty safe to assume that Paul understood Jesus to be the Son of Man that comes to do this. And here is a reference for us in verse 10. He says, we wait for the Son from heaven, right? Who also was raised from the dead. And then he says, which has delivered us from the wrath that is to come. We're going to be talking a little bit more about this wrath. So chapter 1 is simply Paul saying, look, guys, we do the work of our faith, which is to be willing to be cut for a selfless love, because we are hoping and patiently hoping for the Son from heaven, who's going to come and sort everything out. And that's basically what chapter 1 is all about. So let's go to chapter 2 today, and we're going to touch a little bit on some of the things we see here. So one of the one of the highlights of chapter 2 is Paul making mention that he's been shamefully treated. So we saw in the book of Galatians that Paul's not very friendly towards what he calls twice the Jewish religion. And so here it seems like he was maltreated in Philippi, also in, I think just mentions Philippi here, but as he goes into the synagogues, it's his countrymen, it's the Jews that kind of starts to persecute him. Let me just move this camera a little bit, because I think you might have moved. Okay. So, no, just check. So he's a little bit he's not impressed. He's unhappy that his own countrymen are standing up against him, and they're basically persecuting him, and instigating riots and getting driven out of cities for going and trying to say that Jesus is Messiah. And then he spends a bit of time explaining how he came to the church in Thessalonians. And I think here is some stuff that's worthy to be mentioned. And I think if you are a pastor or a leader, or you consider yourself operating in any type of office, here's a little, leaf out of Paul's book on how we recognize those that really come in the proper spirit. And so here's some of the things that he just highlights. I'm not going to read all of it, but just a couple of things. And to me, this, I guess to some degree, has always been the way in which the things I look for in preachers, or in people who consider themselves preachers, teachers, prophets, evangelists, people that come in a type of an office. He says this, he says, I've been entrusted, he says, and I never came with any flattering words. In other words, I don't come to flatter you, make you feel good about yourself. That's not my job. And I think many times we can fall into the trap of motivational speaking, which can end up as flattering words. You can do it, and you are best, there's nothing wrong with you. Paul doesn't take that angle, the angle of flattery. And he says also, I didn't come in a cloak of covetousness. In other words, I didn't come to get stuff from you. I'm not here to receive something from you. I'm here to serve you. He says, God is my witness. I also didn't come to get the glory from men. In other words, to be seen and to be celebrated as a celebrity. And then the last thing he mentions in verse 6 is, I didn't want to be a burden unto you. In other words, he really, I think what is described for us here is the heart and the mission of a servant heart, I think is what
the posture.
The posture, the right posture in which to come. And then he does some things. Paul pulls a weird one on us and uses a female allegory, which is quite interesting for a man from the first century. And he says, I nursed you. Like a nurse I was gentle among you as a nurse that cherishes her children. I was just, nursing here, literally meaning I gave you milk from my breasts, which is quite interesting for Paul. A little bit later on, he will then use a male allegory, but it is interesting to me that Paul sees himself as a male, and he's not worried to use an allegory of the female capabilities, that nursing quality that maybe men are empty of, I guess, to some degree. And then verse 8 is quite interesting, because here in verse 8 we see the faith, hope, and love in a more practical way. He uses the same word toil, and he uses the same word cut, although he doesn't use faith and love. Just uses those verbs, I guess, to try and explain what he was there doing, and what was important to him. So it starts like in verse 8, he says, I didn't just come to bring the gospel of God only. In other words, I didn't just come with a message. That was not my full intention. And I think sometimes, I know myself, definitely, it's easy for preachers to fall into the trap of just wanting to go and speak, and just wanting to go and deliver something and then move. And that could be for many reasons. Maybe you're a bit of a shy person, or you don't like attention, or sometimes you just don't like to be around people. But whatever the reason is, Paul is quite clearly stating here that he didn't just come to deliver a message to people. He goes on to say, but also to impart our souls, to impart our own souls, he says. And then he uses this language, for you remember, brothers, our labor. This word here is the cut. In other words, he's referring to the love. My labor of love, I was willing to be cut amongst you. And travail, for laboring night and day. Laboring here is the word toil, the same one that is connected to faith in the earlier part. So Paul is kind of, in a way, taking the theory of faith, hope, and love and saying, I came to demonstrate it amongst you. Right, that's what we find to about just to around verse 10. And then in verse 11, we get this idea of he is like a father to them, and they are like his children. I think it wasn't uncommon for especially Pharisees to have students and to understand there's like a father-son relationship between those two, the disciple and the teacher. And it wouldn't be weird at all for us to think that is actually how Paul thought about himself with those people. And then he says in verse 12 that you would walk worthy of God, who has called you unto his kingdom and glory. So once again, here we have the idea of the kingdom. We saw in Galatians, kingdom, new creation. This ties into Paul's expectation that there is an imminent coming of this kingdom and this glory being doxa, reputation, magnificence of God that's coming. And as we saw a little bit earlier in chapter 1, he believes that the people he is writing to are divinely chosen for this time, but not only for this time, but specifically selected for this kingdom that's about to manifest itself. And that's why they do these things in hope. He's willing to be persecuted and willing to work and put in the toil and the cutting because of his patient hope for this kingdom of glory, the Son from heaven coming, right? Okay, so then I want to move on to down to verse 14. And once again, here Paul is going to be talking about the Jewish people. And once again, it's not going to be a friendly discourse. It basically goes along the lines of this. He says, we've suffered like things. He's talking about them and himself. We've suffered like things from our own countrymen, even as they have of the Jews. And so he's also maybe referring to the pagans here, or to the Gentiles here that have suffered from their people. But he's also saying in the same way that we've suffered from our own countrymen who are the Jews. And so I think it's quite clear that Paul sees the Jewish community that is not moving with him in this new faith or in this new expectation to be a kind of that stands against him, and there's a tension that's forming. And then it gets a little bit more heated as we go on here. And then he goes in verse 15, he says, who both killed the Lord Jesus and their own prophets. Now, this is quite, It's a bit hectic. As far as we know, the Romans killed Jesus, especially in the early Gospels. But the later you go in the Gospels, the more the blame shifts onto the actual Jewish people. By the time you get to the book of John, it seems like they killed Jesus by how John writes. And over the many centuries, a lot of people have used these kind of portions to, I guess, and this is where a lot of hate against the Jewish people come from. And we saw a lot of persecution in the long before Hitler by the church, the Roman church, against Jews, persecution, killings, forced conversions, because eventually it seems like eventually the church was of the opinion that it was actually the Jews that, the Romans put the nails in, but the Jews are the ones that killed him. And so we do see something like that here in Paul, where he doesn't say the Romans killed him, because that is technically what happened, but he says the Jews killed him. So this is just building on, and I'm not throwing out opinions of what we should believe. That's not what we're doing here. I'm just trying to open up what I think Paul stood for. And I think Paul was not very friendly towards the Jews at this point. They were persecuting him because of the things he was saying. He was saying, Galatians showed us, move on from the Torah. Yeah. It's worth nothing. Basically, he's saying it's a curse, it's bondage. We need to move on from requirements to accepting and to accept the faithfulness of Jesus. So we don't see, this is what we see from Paul, early Paul, and we just have to accept it, that Paul might actually have felt this way. Once again, I'm not saying we should feel like it. I'm just saying that that's kind of what Paul is saying. He goes on in the second part of verse 15 to say that they are contrary to all men. Feels a bit like a judgy scenario here. He's not friendly towards them. And if you followed us through Galatians and now Thessalonians, considering that it's the earliest work of Paul, it is quite safe then to assume that Paul was actually not very friendly towards the Jews or the Jewish religion. He believed they were against everyone, they were against him, they killed Jesus, and it gets a little bit even one more worse here. And he says, forbidding us to speak to the Gentiles that they might be saved, to fill up their sins always, for the wrath is come upon them to the uttermost. And so the wrath we read about earlier on, which can be understood as a passionate action, or it doesn't necessarily need to be violent, but it is a passionate action of someone. Here we have an object for it for the first time. Early on we didn't know, is this wrath coming against, what is it coming against? But here Paul makes clear that in his opinion, this wrath at least is coming to these opposers, his opponents. What we'll get into a little bit later on is to understand a little bit more about Paul's worldview at this time, that Paul's worldview was full of these evil principalities and spirits that were manifesting through people, manifesting through the Jews, manifesting through the Roman world. And this is the thing that Jesus, the Son of Man, the Son from heaven, was coming to make an end of, so that God's kingdom could come and fill the earth. Okay, so here we have an object for the wrath for the first time, and I think that it would be safe to assume that when he talks about the wrath, then we have to include his opponents from the Jewish religion on this, and not against Jewish people, but against those who are unwilling to convert, unwilling to move away from the old ways. So it's not really a racial thing here early in the life of Paul, it's a religious thing. Paul is not against Jewish people, and I think that needs to be made clear. Yeah. He's a Jew himself, and most Christians were Jews at this time. But Paul is unhappy with the conduct of the constituents of the Jewish religion, I guess. Okay. Then if we get down to verse 18, Paul makes a statement. He says he would have loved to have gone to the Thessalonians, but Satan hindered us. So here's the first time Satan is mentioned basically in the New Testament then by Paul. we did a very, very long study. It's still available on Facebook on the evolution of Satan to understand where the idea of Satan came from in Jewish thought. And it is very clear that by the time we get to Paul, Satan is understood to be the leader of the evil fallen angels, demonic powers that have now set themselves up over the world and is the cause of all the pain and the suffering and the evil in the world. And this is also then that which Paul believes he will be saved from. Mm-hmm. And so the most important thing here, I think, and this is not as obvious as we would like it to be, but saved for Paul here is used in verse 16, also for the first time in Paul's writing. Saved here is not, I'm so happy, I'm going to be in heaven forever. Saved for Paul is the escape of the wrath. That's what Paul is referring to. So the opposite of saved here is to fall under this wrath, right? So that's also slightly different to what most of us think about when we today think about saved. Being saved. You know, are you saved? Yes, I said the Ram, and when I die, I'm going straight to heaven. Where really what's going on here in Paul is that Paul says Jesus saves us. To him, that means when the Son of Man comes, his wrath won't fall on us, and we will be able to continue and experience this new kingdom. But there's some unlucky dudes who are not divinely selected, who stand on the outside, under which he includes the opposition in the Jewish religion and possibly others as well. But they will not be saved from. They will not be. They will not be delivered from this, but it will fall upon them. Okay, so here we have Satan for the first time, used as a word, as a name. Paul uses it as a name, and we know that this idea of Satan is something that developed through specifically during the apocalyptic eras of the Jewish religion. Wasn't really present in the very early Torah, but by the time we get to Paul, this is the way the Jewish world understands and views what's going on in the world, it seems, especially the Pharisees. Okay, so last little portion of chapter 2 for today is here on the other side. I'm using little stones here because the wind, as you can see, is blowing a little bit. Paul then says, but who is my crown of rejoicing? So he's talking now to the Thessalonians, and he throws a compliment at them at the end of the chapter by saying, you are like my crown, you are my achievement. Are not even you. He says, so in other words, you are. But then he says, in the presence of our Lord Jesus Christ at his coming. Okay, so here again, it seems, here again, it's the third time, I think, from Galatians to about Thessalonians, about the third time that Paul refers to this at his coming. So one of the most important things, I think, to realize is that Paul was not expecting this to happen in 2023, 2024, 2025. From the early writings of Paul, and as we go into Corinthians and even the rest of Thessalonians, it is quite clear that early Paul believes that it's absolutely imminent. For him. That's why he's saying to the Thessalonians, you are my crown at his coming, because Paul is expecting to be there. And he is expecting the Thessalonians to be there at this point. And he's going to be told, well done, faithful servant. This group, you brought them in the right way. Yeah. They're going to be saved. And I think that is an absolutely crucial element to understanding. That's what we base. To understanding early Paul is to understand that Paul had an imminent expectation of this end of the age scenario that I've tried to explain so many times now. Paul most definitely was not talking about 2,000 years later. That was definitely not in his scope. Although what we have done with it, most of us, and if you've grown up in a Pentecostal charismatic environment, it's the only two I can really speak about because I know the theologies. You are expecting that at any moment, right? Like next Thursday, or since Israel went back to Palestine, the area of Palestine, people have started to predict predictions throughout the 80s and 90s, and it just keeps on pushing forward and forward and forward. People are predicting that at any moment or at this particular point, year 1988 or 2000 or 2012, this massive thing is going to happen. Excuse me. I think that's a complete misreading of the scripture. Paul wasn't expecting it in his time.
Yeah.
And this leaves us with the obvious question. Was Paul wrong? Was he wrong about this? And then you can develop it a little bit further. You can say, I mean, for me, for many years of my life, my young life, up until about age 10 or 12, was preached in our church that, no, Paul was talking about our time.
Yeah.
And I mean, things like, for instance, like my mom was told not to get married even because it's a waste of time. Don't go study. It's a waste of time. Jesus is coming next year. This all is going to happen next year. Didn't happen. And eventually my dad progressed in his way of understanding these verses to believe that no, it definitely isn't talking about a type of rapture, and that it might look a bit different. It might be a kingdom on earth. That's more like early Paul. But my dad still taught that we were living in what is commonly understood to be the end time, which is the time of the end of this old system and the beginning of this new system. So, excuse me. So the question really is, did Paul get it wrong? Later on in my life, I started understanding, and this is called the preterist position, which is, it basically is this, that all of these expectations were fulfilled, but they were fulfilled in kind of the fall of Jerusalem. And that it was the beginning of the kingdom of God, because the old covenant kind of ended with the fall of the temple. Okay. And there was this new kingdom that now starts growing and growing and growing. And eventually it'll produce this new kingdom on earth. It's kind of like a preterist position in which you believe that what Paul believed was true. It did happen in his generation, about
not how
5 years.
We think it will look.
Yes, about 5 years after he died in 70 AD. But it didn't take the form that Paul expected. Or what I've done for a lot of my life, I've pushed my understanding of it back onto Paul and then say, but I think Paul actually understands it the way I understand it. And I've done that for the last 15 years of my life. And I think it was a necessary step for me to move to get to where I am today. But today I'm pretty convinced that there is a possibility that Paul's expectation was skewed by his theological context. That yes, God is busy doing something in the earth and it's producing a kingdom, but Paul was swayed by his theological context, which was an imminent expectation of the change of the entire world system, the end of all evil
in one event,
sin, in like a final event that was coming in his time. Today we sit 2,000 years later and we still have evil and we still sin ourselves and we still die, and evil and suffering and pain are still very much part of every part of our lives. And at some point we need to consider that maybe Paul was influenced by his theological context, by this Jewish apocalyptic way of thinking about the world, and that it might actually look a little bit different, that our expectations should be a little bit different. Something I often say, and I think it's pretty important, is that Paul himself makes mention of this in Corinthians, that he sees in part, which I think is a hugely humble position to take. Yeah. That he sees in part, but one day he'll see with a better and a full view, that now he sees through a dark glass. And now, I really today, my position is simply that Paul's dark glass is his own context. And I think he knew at some point that to some degree he is swayed or influenced by his context, and it might take different forms. So that's a pretty bold position to take, but that is my position today where I sit here, that Paul did in fact see through a dark glass, and part of that dark glass was the Jewish apocalyptic expectation of Paul. So next week we're going into chapter 3 and 4, and it all builds up to these little portions that normally people use for the rapture. And that's where it gets interesting, because questions arise. For instance, Paul, It's been, Thessalonians was written in the 50s. It's been 20 years and Jesus has not come yet back to do all of this. And my uncle died last month. How's he going to get to this kingdom? And Paul had a really good answer for that. And we're going to be talking about that in the weeks to come. So today I want to leave you 5 minutes early, 5 or 10 minutes early. It's freezing out here. And I can feel myself getting congested as I'm sitting here. But 2 Thessalonians, then basically what we're dealing with here is number one, Paul's posture when he goes to the churches. I think we could still learn a lot from him there. I think pastors can learn a lot from Paul's posture here. Seen so much the opposite, flattery, covetousness, becoming a burden to people, wanting the glory and the fame and the celebrity. And unfortunately, those things just, we know they don't work because they always end up in an absolute disaster. So Paul's posture is important to us here. The fact that he was a demonstrator of the idea of faith, work of faith, the cutting of love, labor of love, and this patience he had, hoping. Because by the time he writes, it's been 20 years and nothing's happened yet. And what do you say to people when it hasn't happened? You say, guys, you must be patient. God's timing, that's what we would do with it. And so this is kind of what this letter is about. Then we went through the ideas of Paul believing that there's a wrath that's coming upon the Jewish people. We picked that up in the book of Matthew as well, but Matthew was written so much later, I wouldn't be surprised if Matthew drew some of it from the writings of Paul anyway. That this is wrath coming, but we are saved. We are selected, him and his people, they selected, and he's very proud of them because when Jesus comes, they'll be like his crown. And then the last point today was that Paul expected an imminent coming of the Son of Man, Jesus Christ from heaven. This is why they have to be patient. This is why they have hope.
Yeah.
Because life's not going to be like this forever. It's soon going to change. Everything's going to change. So, okay, that's another step in the direction that we're moving in. And to me, this is incredibly interesting because I've been studying these books for about 20 years and
so new.
I feel like I'm moving in the right direction for the first time in my life. Anyway, have a wonderful week.
Yes.
I will see
Stay
you
warm.
next time.
See you soon.
Yes, Tori, let's go inside.
Let's get warm.
Cheers, guys.
Bye.